They say betrayal feels like a knife in the back. But when it's from someone you trusted with everything, it feels like the knife goes straight through your heart. My name is Claire Donovan, and 5 years ago I lost everything. Not because of bad luck, not because of my own mistakes, but because the person I trusted most decided greed was worth more than friendship. Daniel Hayes and I had built our startup from scratch. We worked out of coffee shops and my cramped apartment in the early days, pulling all-nighters and living off instant noodles. He was the smooth talker, the networker, the one who could walk into a room and charm the money out of investors' pockets. I was the builder, the strategist, the one who made sure the product worked, that deadlines were met, that our vision didn't collapse under pressure. We were supposed to be a team. And for a while it felt like we were. We landed our first round of funding after a brutal 6-month grind. And from there, things took off. Our app, Synchro, was a hit, streamlining project management in a way no competitor had managed to do yet. Investors were calling us instead of the other way around. I thought Daniel and I were on the same path, chasing the same dream. But I didn't see the signs. Or maybe I didn't want to see them. Late-night meetings I wasn't invited to. Quiet phone calls he took in the hallway. The way he'd brush off my questions with a grin and a, "Don't worry about it, Claire, I've got us covered." It all came crashing down the day we signed what I thought was the acquisition deal of a lifetime. A major tech giant wanted to buy Synchro. The offer was huge, life-changing. We'd each walk away with tens of millions. Or so I thought. The lawyers slid the paperwork across the table. I flipped through the pages, feeling that electric buzz of everything about to change. Daniel signed first, flashing me that familiar smile. I signed second, not realizing the trap had already been sprung. It wasn't until the wire transfer came through that I realized something was wrong. My account showed a fraction of what I was owed. I thought there had been a mistake, a clerical error. Called Daniel. He didn't answer. When I finally reached our lawyer, his tone was clipped, professional, and cold. "Claire, I suggest you review the partnership agreement you signed 6 months ago." Daniel became the sole shareholder in the company prior to the acquisition. "You were compensated for your consulting work, as per the revised terms." Revised terms. Consulting work. My stomach dropped. I dug out the documents from months before. The ones Daniel had pushed in front of me during a hectic week, saying, "Just standard legal housekeeping, nothing major. Sign so we can keep the investors happy." I had signed them without a second thought. And just like that, my 50% ownership in Synchro had been rewritten out of existence. Daniel walked away with $48 million. I walked away with less than $200,000. The news stories painted it as a brilliant business move. Hayes orchestrates masterstroke acquisition, one headline read. I saw my name once in a single sentence. Claire Donovan, an early collaborator on Synchro, is reportedly pursuing other ventures. No one knew I had been the architect of the entire product. No one knew the truth. And Daniel. He was suddenly everywhere. Magazine covers, tech conferences, flashy interviews where he talked about his vision and his leadership. I couldn't open my phone without seeing his smug smile. I didn't just lose my company. I lost my reputation, my place in the industry, and the life I'd built. I moved out of the city, cut ties with almost everyone, and disappeared. For 2 years I lived quietly. On the outside, it looked like I'd given up. On the inside, I was building. I took freelance work at first. Coding, consulting, small strategy projects for startups that couldn't afford big agencies. Then I partnered with a small cybersecurity firm, helping them secure contracts with government agencies. The money started to flow in. I invested it carefully, never showing my hand. Every dollar I earned was fuel. Every success was a brick in the wall I was building between the woman Daniel betrayed and the woman who was going to destroy him. By year 3, I had my own company, Orion Systems, specializing in high-security data infrastructure. We weren't flashy, but we were indispensable. Our clients were banks, law firms, medical research facilities, the kind of organizations that valued discretion above all else. Orion grew fast. Too fast for Daniel to notice, because we didn't make headlines. I stayed out of the press, letting my CEO, a brilliant camera-ready operator named Maya Cortez. Be the face of the brand. By the end of year 4, I was worth 8 figures. Quietly. Invisibly. And that's when I saw it. A headline buried in the business section. Hayes Tech faces sharp decline as market competition increases. I clicked the article. My eyes scanned every word. His new company, Hayes Tech Solutions, was bleeding clients. Investors were losing confidence. Rumors of internal chaos were swirling. For the first time in years. Smiled. It wasn't enough to see him struggling. I wanted to be the reason he failed. I wanted to walk into his life, sit across from him, and watch him realize that the woman he cheated out of millions was now in a position to decide whether he could even pay his employees next month. The plan began taking shape immediately. Step 1 was visibility, but on my terms. I started appearing at industry events again, always in the orbit of the people Daniel needed to impress. Never directly engaging with him. Just close enough for him to hear my name in passing, to see me shaking hands with his competitors, to feel that flicker of unease. Step 2 was infiltration. Hayes Tech's client list wasn't hard to obtain. Too many former employees were willing to talk for the price of a dinner and a few drinks. I circled his biggest accounts, offering Orion's services at rates he couldn't match. We weren't just cheaper. We were faster, more secure, and backed by a reputation he couldn't touch. Within 6 months, I had poached 3 of his top clients. I hadn't even spoken to him yet. And already, I could feel him losing ground. But I didn't want to take him out quietly. Well, Daniel loved public victories, so I was going to give him a public defeat. That's why I made the call. Daniel Hayes. This is Claire Donovan. We need to talk. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to imagine his expression, the flicker of recognition, the surprise that I'd dared to call. Claire, he said finally. His voice a mix of amusement and wariness. Well, I thought you'd disappeared. Oh, I've been around, I said, my tone smooth. And I think you'll be interested in what I have to offer. That was the hook. And he took it. The thing about people like Daniel Hayes is, they always think they're the smartest person in the room. That arrogance is a weakness, one I planned to exploit until there was nothing left of him but the echo of his own bad decisions. When he agreed to meet, I suggested the Sterling, a sleek rooftop bar in the city's financial district. Neutral ground, but upscale enough to match his ego. It was the kind of place where every table felt like a power play. I arrived first, deliberately choosing a table by the window, the skyline glittering behind me. I wanted him to see me framed by success before we even exchanged a word. My hair was perfectly styled, my suit was tailored. My watch was a subtle piece of Swiss engineering worth more than most people's cars. Every detail mattered. When Daniel finally walked in, I recognized him instantly. Though he looked different. Still sharp in appearance, yes, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a faint tightness around his smile. He scanned the room, spotted me, and made his way over. Claire, he said as he slid into the chair opposite me. His voice warm but edged with caution. It's been, what, 5 years? Almost, I said evenly. Time flies when you're rebuilding your life. His smile twitched, but he didn't bite at the jab. I have to say, you look successful. What have you been up to? I leaned back, letting him wonder. Oh, few ventures, some work. Some worked very well. He studied me, searching for cracks. I didn't give him any. I was surprised you reached out, he said. After everything. I let the silence stretch before I answered. I thought it was time we had a proper conversation. We left some things unresolved. His eyes narrowed slightly. Claire, if this is about the past. It's not, I interrupted smoothly. This is about business. I have an opportunity one think you'd be interested in. The shift in his expression was subtle but telling. He relaxed just enough for me to see the calculation in his eyes. This was the Daniel I remembered, always on the hunt for the next deal, the next edge. I'm listening, he said. I didn't give him the real pitch. Not yet. This meeting wasn't about the deal. It was about planting seeds. I've been expanding into markets that I think could benefit Hayes Tech. You've been having some challenges with retention, haven't you? The flicker in his eyes told me I'd hit a nerve. Every company has challenges, he said lightly. Of course, I replied, letting a faint smile curve my lips. But I have a way to solve them. I'm proposing a strategic partnership. Partnership, he repeated, leaning back in his chair. That's a big word coming from you. Consider it a fresh start, I said. We combine resources for a specific project, share the credit, and both walk away stronger. He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle. And why would you offer that to me? I let the question hang, then answered with a cool, controlled voice. Because I believe in turning old mistakes into new opportunities. That was the hook inside the hook, an offer that looked like an olive branch but was really a baited trap. We talked for another hour, trading surface-level details while I watched him carefully. He tried to fish for information about my business, but I kept it vague, redirecting every question back to his current projects. By the time we stood to leave, I knew more about Hayes Tech's vulnerabilities than I had going in. Before he walked away, I leaned in just enough for only him to hear. It's funny, isn't it? How quickly fortunes can change. His eyes sharpened. Is that a threat, Claire? Smiled. No, Daniel. It's a reminder. The partnership was never real. It was my way in, a reason to interact with his team, to sit in his meetings, to watch his operations up close. Over the next few weeks, we arranged a series of joint planning sessions. He insisted we meet at Hayes Tech headquarters, a sleek glass and steel building that screamed, "Look at me." The first time I walked into the lobby, I felt a flicker of memory, of my own startup's office, back before he gutted it. This time I wasn't an employee. I was a shark swimming into the tank. Daniel's assistant, a sharp young woman named Rachel, greeted me warmly. Too warmly. She was loyal, that much was clear. But loyalty could be shifted. I made a note to learn her ambitions. In the conference room, Daniel played the gracious host, introducing me to his senior staff. I read each of them like a book. There was Martin, the CFO, who was clearly exhausted and covering it with forced cheer. Priya, the head of product, who lit up when she talked about her work but deflated whenever Daniel interrupted. And Leo, head of sales, too slick by half, and clearly worried about numbers he wasn't sharing. I didn't push, not at first. I let them talk. I took notes, asked questions that seemed innocent but were designed to make them reveal more than they intended. Within a week, I had a clearer picture of Hayes Tech's weaknesses than some of its own executives. Step 1 was to destabilize without being seen as the cause. I started with the CFO. Martin was under pressure. Too many missed targets, too many cost overruns. In one casual conversation over coffee, I mentioned a well-paying CFO role at another firm I happened to know about. The idea wasn't to get him to leave immediately, just to plant the thought that he could. Once someone starts imagining life elsewhere, their focus slips. Mistakes happen. Next was Priya. She was passionate but clearly underappreciated. I praised her work, suggested that she should be leading projects with bigger budgets. Hinted that other companies would kill for her skill set. A few weeks later, she was openly questioning Daniel's priorities in meetings. With Leo, the approach was simpler: feed his ego. I made sure to drop compliments about his pitch style, then casually mention rumors I'd heard about his department missing quotas. Nothing too sharp, just enough to make him defensive. Defensive people make reckless moves. All of it added up to small cracks in Daniel's leadership. Cracks that would widen with the right pressure. Daniel, for his part, was clearly enjoying the idea of working with me. He thought it made him look magnanimous, the kind of man who could put the past behind him for the sake of business. I let him think that. But I also made sure to be just a little unpredictable, canceling a meeting last minute, showing up at events where he didn't expect me, dropping hints about deals Orion was making without revealing details. Kept him off balance. One evening, after a long strategy session, we ended up at a bar near his office. The conversation drifted toward the early days of synchro. You know, he said, sipping his drink, we made a hell of a team back then. We did, I agreed. Until you decided you wanted the whole pie for yourself. His smile didn't falter, but his grip on the glass tightened. It was business, Claire. You know how it is. Business doesn't excuse betrayal, I said softly. For the first time that night, he didn't have a quick answer. 2 days later, I made my first decisive move. Through a third-party contact, I approached one of Hayes Tech's most lucrative clients, a multinational logistics firm, with a proposal from Orion. We offered better security, faster integration, and a price they couldn't ignore. The deal closed in less than a week. When the announcement went public, I made sure it appeared in the same industry newsletter that Daniel's investors read. The next time I saw him, he was all charm. But the tension in his jaw told me everything I needed to know. One client down. Many more to go. Daniel's office was exactly what I expected. Glass walls, polished marble floors, and an oversized desk that looked more like a prop than a functional workspace. It was a statement piece, meant to broadcast power. I could see my own reflection in the glass behind him as he stood to greet me. That trademark smile stretched across his face like he'd been practicing it in the mirror. Claire, he said warmly, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. You look incredible. I wasn't sure you'd actually show. I took his hand briefly, my grip firm but not lingering. I wouldn't have called if I wasn't serious. We sat across from each other, him behind the desk, me in the leather chair opposite. He leaned back, studying me the way a cat studies a bird, deciding whether it's worth the pounce. So, he said finally, what's this opportunity you mentioned? I gave him a faint smile. I've been watching Hayes Tech's trajectory lately. Seems like you've hit a few bumps in the road. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. Every company faces challenges. We're still strong. I'm sure you are, I said smoothly. But I think I can help you get back on the offensive. My company has certain capabilities. Capabilities I think you could benefit from. Your company, he repeated, like he was rolling the words around in his mouth. And what exactly is that company? Kept my tone casual. Orion Systems. We specialize in high-security infrastructure for high-value clients. Discreet, reliable, and fast. He gave a low chuckle. So you want to partner with me? After everything that happened? I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. I believe in turning past mistakes into future opportunities. Daniel smirked. Or maybe you're just looking for a way back into the big leagues. I met his gaze without blinking. Daniel, I've been in the big leagues for years. You just didn't notice. That made him pause. I could see the faintest flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that. Not anymore. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the armrests. Here's what I'm proposing. Orion and Hayes Tech collaborate on a joint contract for a major client I'm about to sign. You handle the front-end interface, we handle the back-end security. Split the profit down the middle. If it works, maybe we look at more projects. He narrowed his eyes slightly. And why me? There are a dozen companies you could work with. I let a slow smile spread across my face. Because I know you, Daniel. I know exactly how you work. And despite everything, I know you can close deals like no one else. He didn't know it, but the real reason I wanted him involved was so I could get inside his operations, see every weakness up close. This wasn't a partnership. It was reconnaissance. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Claire. Let's explore this. I gave a small, satisfied nod. Good. I'll have my COO send over the preliminary documents. As I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. You know, he said casually, I've missed this. You and me scheming together. Feels like old times. I glanced over my shoulder at him. Old times are exactly why I'm here. I left without giving him a chance to respond. The next few weeks were a dance. On the surface, we were collaborating, meetings, conference calls, brainstorming sessions. But beneath it, I was collecting information. I learned which clients were unhappy, which employees were restless, which suppliers were causing delays. I didn't have to dig hard. Daniel's arrogance had bred carelessness in his team. I focused first on his CFO, Martin. We'd met briefly before, but now I made a point of sitting near him in meetings, asking him about projections, complimenting his financial acumen. One afternoon over coffee I mentioned, offhandedly, that a large tech firm I knew was looking for a seasoned CFO to lead their expansion into Europe. His eyes lit up despite himself. He said he wasn't looking to leave, but the seed was planted. Seeds grow. Next was Priya, head of product. She was brilliant but clearly frustrated by Daniel's constant meddling. In one private conversation, she vented about a project delay caused by Daniel overruling her team's recommendations. I listened, validated her concerns, and casually mentioned how, in my company, department heads had full autonomy over their projects. I saw the way she considered that. And then there was Leo, head of sales. He was charming, quick-talking, but I could smell the desperation on him. Numbers were slipping, and he knew it. I praised his energy, then dropped hints about competitors winning over clients who used to be loyal to Hayes Tech. His defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. He was vulnerable. Bit by bit, I was loosening the bolts that held Daniel's leadership together. But I needed more than internal chaos. I needed leverage. And leverage meant clients. Through one of my quieter channels, I approached one of Hayes Tech's oldest accounts, a multinational logistics firm worth millions annually. My pitch was simple. Orion could offer faster deployment, tighter security, and lower costs. Within 2 meetings, they were ready to switch. When the contract was signed, I timed the announcement perfectly, just before Daniel's quarterly investor call. The fallout was immediate. Investors questioned his ability to retain major accounts. His team scrambled to contain the damage. And I sat back, smiling as the first real crack appeared in his armor. A week later, Daniel called me into his office. He was all polite professionalism, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. "Claire," he said, "I hope this so-called partnership isn't turning into competition." I gave him an innocent look. Competition. Daniel, that client came to me. I can't control who chooses Orion over Hayes Tech. He studied me, trying to read my face. "You've changed," he said finally. "I've grown," I corrected. "And so should you." The truth was, I wanted him off balance. The more time he spent trying to figure me out, the less time he'd have to shore up his crumbling business. Over the next month, I turned up the pressure. Orion quietly targeted 2 more of his top accounts, winning them both. His CFO started missing deadlines. Priya began pushing back publicly in meetings. Leo made a disastrous pitch that cost him a major prospect. Each failure was a tiny cut, and Daniel didn't even realize I was the one holding the knife. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A message from one of Daniel's mid-level managers. They were unhappy, underpaid, and sitting on information that could make my life very interesting. We met in a quiet cafe far from the city center. Over black coffee, they slid a folder across the table. Inside were internal reports, missed revenue targets, spiraling expenses, client complaints. Evidence that Hayes Tech was far weaker than Daniel let on. I thanked them, tucked the folder into my bag, and knew the game had shifted. I wasn't just weakening Daniel anymore. I was positioning myself to take him down completely. The next time we met, I noticed the change in him. His smile was tighter, his suit a little less crisp. The confidence he'd worn like armor was starting to crack. He tried to keep the conversation light, reminiscing about the early days of Synchro, even hinting at how good it felt to work together again. I sipped my coffee and let him talk, offering only small smiles and vague answers. Inside, I was already mapping my next move, the one that would take him from bleeding to bankrupt. And I knew when it came, he wouldn't see it until it was too late. The air in Daniel's office felt heavier the next time I visited. The blinds were half drawn, muting the skyline that he usually loved to display behind him like a crown jewel. He greeted me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, gesturing for me to sit. I could tell before he even opened his mouth that things had worsened for him since our last meeting. "Claire," he began, his tone light but forced, "you've been busy." "I stay productive," I replied, keeping my tone smooth. "I've noticed," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Orion has been making quite a few moves lately. Some in familiar territory." I gave him an innocent look. "Business is business, Daniel. Clients go where they feel taken care of." He studied me for a moment, his jaw tight. "I hope this overlap doesn't interfere with our project." "Our project is moving along just fine," I said, allowing a faint smile. "But I can't promise the market won't shift. You know how it is." I could almost see the thoughts running through his head. Suspicions, calculations, the dawning awareness that he might not be in control of the game anymore. Over the next few weeks, I deepened the cracks in his empire. Orion's sales team targeted his most vulnerable accounts with precision. We offered not only better prices but guarantees, custom solutions that Hayes Tech couldn't match without overhauling their entire infrastructure. Clients who had been with him for years began signing with me, each one a quiet, devastating blow. But I needed more than just client theft. I needed a way to accelerate his downfall. That's when I went back to the folder the disillusioned manager had given me. Inside were quarterly reports showing a troubling trend. Hayes Tech had been inflating projected revenues to keep investors calm. If the truth came out, confidence in the company would plummet overnight. I didn't plan to release the information right away. Timing was everything. I wanted him to be desperate first, to make mistakes he couldn't recover from. And for that, I needed to tighten the noose financially. I started with Martin, his CFO. By now, I had built enough rapport to invite him out for drinks under the guise of discussing industry trends. Halfway through his second whiskey, he admitted that they were struggling with cash flow. "We've had to delay vendor payments twice this quarter," he said, lowering his voice. "Daniel doesn't want the board to know." I nodded sympathetically while mentally filing it away. Late payments meant strained relationships with suppliers, which could be exploited. Within a week, I had Orion approach two of Hayes Tech's key vendors with long-term contracts, paid upfront. Tempted by the stability, both suppliers quietly reduced their availability to Daniel's company. It was a small disruption, but enough to cause internal chaos. Meanwhile, I kept working on Priya. Her frustration with Daniel was reaching a breaking point. In one private meeting, I casually mentioned a leadership role at Orion that came with full autonomy and a significant pay bump. I didn't press her for an answer, but I saw the spark in her eyes. That spark would soon turn into action. And then there was Leo. His desperation was becoming more obvious. He'd started promising unrealistic delivery timelines to close deals, which only led to more client dissatisfaction. I made sure that word of these delays reached potential clients before his pitches did, quietly sabotaging his department from the outside. By month's end, Hayes Tech had lost 4 more accounts to Orion. Daniel called me late one night, his voice tense. "We need to meet," he said. We met the next morning at a small, discreet cafe. His choice, not mine. He looked tired, the faint stubble on his jaw a telltale sign that he hadn't slept well. "I'm starting to think this partnership isn't benefiting me as much as it's benefiting you," he said, leaning forward. I sipped my coffee, letting him stew in the silence for a moment before answering. "Maybe you're not leveraging it correctly." He narrowed his eyes. "Or maybe you're using it to gut my company from the inside." I smiled faintly. "Daniel, if I wanted to gut your company, you wouldn't still be standing." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And he knew it. He exhaled, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Look, Claire, I'm willing to work with you. But this can't keep going the way it is. We're losing too many accounts." "Then maybe you should take a closer look at why they're leaving," I said, my voice calm but cutting. It's not just about price. It's about trust, reliability, leadership. He flinched at that last word just slightly. I stood, leaving a generous tip on the table. I'll be in touch, I said, and walked out without looking back. I didn't need him to like me. I needed him to fear losing me. The next step in my plan required patience. I began setting up a meeting with one of his largest remaining clients, a global manufacturing firm whose contract was worth millions annually. I knew their CTO personally from a past project, and it didn't take much to arrange a private discussion. Over dinner, I learned that they were unhappy with Hayes Tech's recent performance. Delays, cost overruns, and poor communication had eroded their trust. I didn't push them to switch that night. Instead, I offered to audit their systems as a friendly favor. When my team delivered a report highlighting every flaw in Hayes Tech's implementation, the client made the decision themselves. Within a month, the contract was mine. The loss hit Daniel hard. This wasn't just another client, it was a flagship account, one he'd used in marketing materials and investor pitches. Its departure sent shockwaves through his boardroom. I heard through my contacts that the board had begun questioning his leadership. Investors were whispering about replacing him as CEO. That was exactly what I wanted. Pressure from every direction, forcing him to make rash, costly moves. At the same time, I began cultivating relationships with journalists who covered the tech sector. I didn't feed them the damaging reports yet, but I hinted that there were interesting developments happening at Hayes Tech. It was enough to make them start digging, and I knew that when the time came, they'd be ready to pounce on whatever I gave them. Inside his company, my influence was growing. Martin was actively looking for a new job. Priya had begun taking interviews with Orion. Leo's numbers were so bad that even Daniel couldn't ignore them anymore. Every day, the walls were closing in, and he didn't know where the next hit would come from. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing the latest acquisition proposal for Orion, I received a text from an unknown number. It was short, almost cryptic. He's planning something big. Might be worth your time to find out what. No name, no context. But I had a feeling I knew who it was from. The same mid-level manager who had given me the internal reports. I replied simply, when and where? An hour later I had the details. Daniel was meeting with a private equity group in 3 days. If he landed their investment, it could give Hayes Tech the lifeline it desperately needed. I couldn't let that happen. The next morning I set the wheels in motion. I reached out to one of the senior partners at the equity group, an old contact from my cybersecurity days. Over lunch, I casually mentioned the client losses, the internal turmoil, the inflated revenue projections. I didn't hand over the documents yet. I just gave enough to plant doubt. 2 days later I heard from my contact. The meeting had been postponed indefinitely. When Daniel found out, I could almost feel his frustration through the silence that followed. He didn't call me this time. He knew better. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. I still had the reports. I still had the journalists waiting. And soon, very soon, the truth about Hayes Tech would be public. I wanted to time it perfectly. Right after his next quarterly report, when the gap between his public numbers and reality would be impossible to explain away. That's when I'd deliver the final blow. And when it landed, there would be no coming back for Daniel Hayes. The weeks leading up to Daniel's quarterly earnings call felt like the slow tightening of a bowstring. Every move I made was deliberate, every conversation calculated. He didn't realize it, but by now I had control over the two most important levers in his business. His revenue streams and his reputation. All that remained was pulling both at the same time. The call was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Investors, analysts, board members, they would all be listening. I planned to make sure what they heard would trigger a chain reaction he couldn't stop. 2 weeks before the call, I reached out to the journalists I'd been quietly cultivating for months. I didn't give them the full set of internal reports yet, but I sent them just enough to get their attention. Client losses, unfulfilled contracts, and discrepancies between Hayes Tech's official revenue figures and the numbers in the private documents I had. They didn't need convincing. They'd been circling Daniel for a while, waiting for the right moment to sink their teeth in. In parallel, I turned up the pressure inside his company. Priya had already accepted my offer to join Orion, but she agreed to stay at Hayes Tech until after the earnings call, just long enough to watch the implosion from the inside. Martin, the CFO, had one foot out the door. I encouraged him to delay a couple of critical vendor payments, framing it as cash flow management. The delays would hit just before the call, adding to the chaos. Then there was Leo. His department had missed their quarterly targets by a mile. Daniel had been ignoring the issue for weeks, but now, with the call looming, he was forced to confront it. The problem was Leo didn't have answers. Only excuses. And Daniel hated excuses. 3 days before the call, I received a message from Priya. He's scrambling. Meeting with the board tonight. He's hiding the real numbers. That was my cue. That night, I sent the full set of internal reports to my most trusted journalist contact, along with a note. Publish this the morning of the call. He won't be able to spin it. I knew what would happen next. The journalist would verify the documents, cross-reference them with other sources, and then run the story. By the time Daniel logged in for the earnings call, the news would already be spreading through the industry like wildfire. The morning arrived crisp and clear. I woke early, poured myself a coffee, and opened my laptop. At exactly 8 a.m., the headline hit. Exclusive. Hayes Tech inflated revenue figures amid client exodus. The article was brutal, meticulously detailed, backed by leaked documents and quotes from unnamed company insiders. It painted Daniel as a desperate, reckless CEO willing to mislead investors to keep his sinking ship afloat. Within minutes, the story was trending on business news feeds, shared by analysts, and dissected by industry commentators. I could only imagine the look on his face when he saw it. At 9 a.m., the earnings call began. I didn't have access to the board's private line, but I listened to the public stream. Daniel's voice was steady at first, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that hadn't been there before. He launched into his prepared remarks, talking about strategic restructuring and long-term growth initiatives. Then the questions started. Mr. Hayes, one analyst said, can you comment on the reports this morning regarding inflated revenue projections? Silence for half a second. Those claims are baseless, Daniel replied quickly. Our financials are audited and accurate. Another analyst jumped in. So you're saying the leaked documents are fabricated? I'm saying, Daniel began, his tone sharpening, that our focus is on delivering value to our clients. But the analysts weren't letting it go. One after another, they pressed him on the discrepancies, on the client losses, on the late payments to vendors. His answers grew more defensive, more vague. By the time the call ended, Hayes Tech stock had dropped 12%. And that was just the beginning. The fallout was immediate. Within 48 hours, 2 of his remaining major clients terminated their contracts, citing loss of confidence. Vendors began demanding upfront payments. Rumors of board meetings without Daniel present started circulating. Inside the company, morale collapsed. Priya handed in her resignation the day after the call, officially joining Orion. Martin gave notice the following week, leaving Daniel without his most trusted numbers man. I kept my distance publicly, but behind the scenes, I was orchestrating the next blow. Through one of my contacts in the investment community, I learned that Daniel was trying to secure emergency funding to keep the company afloat. If he got it, he could buy himself enough time to recover. I couldn't let that happen. Using a combination of truth and insinuation, I made sure potential investors knew about the instability inside Hayes Tech. I didn't have to say, don't invest. I just laid out the facts in a way that made the risk seem unacceptable. Deals quietly evaporated before they even reached the negotiation stage. Meanwhile, Orion began absorbing Hayes Tech's former clients at a pace that even surprised me. The manufacturing firm I'd won earlier brought us 2 new referrals. The logistics company that had switched months ago signed an expanded contract. My revenue was climbing as his was collapsing. The final blow came 2 months later. A whistleblower complaint, likely from my original inside source, triggered a formal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The investigation froze Hayes Tech's accounts pending review, cutting off their ability to operate normally. That was the moment Daniel called me. I let it go to voicemail. His voice, when I listened later, was nothing like the man I'd known. Gone was the swagger, the easy confidence. In its place was something raw. Blair, I know what you've been doing. I know it's you. I need to know why. Wasn't taking synchro enough for you. You had to destroy me completely. I didn't call him back. He already knew the answer. A week later, Hayes Tech filed for bankruptcy protection. The board ousted him as CEO. His personal assets were frozen pending the investigation. I read the news at my desk, the late afternoon light slanting across my office. Maya, my son, knocked and stepped in, holding a printout of the article. "It's done," she said simply. I nodded, a slow smile spreading across my face. Yes, it is. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that the man who had once stolen everything from me was now left with nothing. Not his company, not his reputation, not even the illusion of control. And as I sat there, watching the sun dip below the skyline, I knew one thing for certain. In business, revenge isn't served cold. It's served calculated, precise. And at exactly the moment your opponent thinks they might survive. Bankruptcy is a strange thing. On paper, it's just a legal process, an arrangement of numbers and filings. But in reality, it's the slow public unraveling of a life. For Daniel Hayes, it was more than just the end of Hayes Tech. It was the collapse of everything he had built his identity on. The news hit the business world like a storm. Every major outlet ran some version of the story. Hayes Tech files for bankruptcy after SEC probe. Analysts picked apart his mistakes on live television, calling him reckless, arrogant, and out of touch. Former employees gave anonymous interviews about the chaos inside his company. The man who once graced magazine covers was now a cautionary tale. His name synonymous with corporate downfall. I didn't gloat publicly. That wasn't my style. But behind closed doors, I allowed myself moments of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about humiliating him in front of the world. It was about balance. The scales had been uneven for too long, and I had finally corrected them. Still, there was one thing left undone. I needed to see him. Not for closure, not really. I just wanted him to look me in the eye and understand without question that I had been the architect of his downfall. It wasn't hard to find him. He'd retreated to a penthouse apartment in the city, one of the few personal assets the courts hadn't yet seized. It was smaller than his old place, but still luxurious, though I suspected he wouldn't be able to keep it for long. I called him, this time not hiding my number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was flat. "Claire." "Daniel," I said evenly. "We should talk. Face to face." There was a long pause. "Why?" "You'll see." Another pause. Then, "Fine. Come by." When I arrived, the doorman barely looked up as I passed through the lobby. Upstairs, Daniel opened the door himself. He looked diminished. His hair was longer, his face unshaven, his once perfectly tailored clothes replaced with a loose sweater and jeans. But it was his eyes that struck me. They had lost the gleam of certainty, replaced with something tired, something hollow. He gestured me in without a word. The apartment was immaculate but sterile, like a place someone was just passing through. We sat across from each other at a low glass table. He didn't offer me a drink. "You wanted to see me," he said, his tone clipped. "Yes." I held his gaze. "I wanted to make sure you knew this wasn't an accident. What happened to Hayes Tech, it was me." His jaw tightened. "I figured as much. You stole everything from me, Daniel. Synchro wasn't just a company. It was years of my life, my work, my trust. You didn't just take my money. You took my reputation, my place in the industry. You thought I'd disappear. You thought I'd just accept it." His voice rose. "You don't understand. I did what I had to do. You were naive. You didn't have the stomach for the kind of deals we were making. If I hadn't taken control, Synchro wouldn't have survived. I leaned forward. Synchro survived. Thrive. You're the one who didn't. For a moment, he looked like he might argue. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a bitter laugh. Congratulations, Claire. You won. This was never about winning, I said softly. It was about making sure you could never do to someone else what you did to me. He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. You spent years planning this. Yes, I said simply. Every step, every move, every client you lost, every investor who walked away, it was all part of the same plan. And you didn't even see it. Silence settled between us. Outside, the city lights blinked in the distance. Finally I stood. Goodbye, Daniel. He didn't follow me to the door. The elevator ride down felt strangely light. Not because I was happy, it wasn't that kind of satisfaction, but because I knew it was over. The debt between us was paid. In the months that followed, the SEC investigation concluded. Daniel was fined heavily and barred from serving as an executive in any publicly traded company for the next 10 years. Hayes Tech's remaining assets were sold off to pay creditors. The industry moved on, but the story of Daniel Hayes became a quiet warning passed between entrepreneurs. Don't burn bridges you can't rebuild. Orion, meanwhile, entered a period of rapid growth. With Priya leading product, Martin managing finances, and my reputation quietly restored in the right circles, we began landing contracts I had once only dreamed of. We expanded into Europe and Asia, built a second headquarters, and tripled our client base. Sometimes when I walk through our offices, I think back to those early days at Synchro, nights of takeout and sleepless coding marathons, the shared belief that we were building something important. I wonder if Daniel ever misses that feeling the way I do. But then I remember the look in his eyes when I told him it was me, and I know the answer. Revenge, I've learned, is not about rage. It's about patience. It's about knowing that the best way to dismantle someone's empire is not to knock it down in one blow, but to pull it apart piece by piece until they're left standing in the rubble, wondering when it all went wrong. And the truth. By the time they figure it out, it's already too late. So here I am telling you this story. Not for sympathy, not for applause, but for the lesson. Trust is earned, not given. And if someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you believe in getting justice, whether in business, in life, or in love, hit that like button, subscribe to Revenge Fury, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because trust me, there's always another one.